those statistics are, yeah, it's unspeakable. I mean, this really is a calculated slaughter of mostly children, um, and it's out in the open. I mean, they're not even hiding it. And I know we'll get into this in the discussion, but statements from high level officials like Israel Katz, for example, just outwardly genocidal intent that, is like, Francesca Albanese of the UN always talks about how it's really hard when you're trying to indict people who have done a genocide because they're very good at hiding the intent, which is a huge factor in the international criminal court system. In order to define genocide and put sanctions on or indict and prosecute these leaders who are doing it, but Israeli leaders are just openly saying it, and still, I mean, it's rendered, as we talked with Craig Mochaiber last week, it's what is the utility of international law if it is rendered meaningless in these ways?
The
It's
Israelis aren't even they're just saying it straight out. That is,
yeah,
I report on their field reports every week, and their field reports since the resumption of this war is that they killed superintendents of the school board,
yeah,
and they bombed a bunch of pickup trucks that had nothing to do with anything, amid 450 airstrikes
yeah,
on tents.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's I don't know, unspeakable. We have a few things that we want to get into in terms of the discussion. John, you mentioned the protests. I know that Ahmed Massoud also mentioned protests. It was kind of a focal point of Western corporate mainstream media that there were these protests that were being labeled as anti-Hamas, and of course, the Israeli media, the Israeli politicians, and the Western media and Western politicians are very interested in these kinds of protests. Ali, what did you notice? What can we say about what's behind these protests?
Yeah, thank you, John, for that report, and thank you, Nora. And yeah, of course, the headlines have been screaming from the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the big media, anti-Hamas protests. And of course, that's very significant to them, if true, because the whole point of this Holocaust and massacre campaign, I mean, of course, the main point is killing Palestinians for the sake of killing them and exterminating them. But another purpose is to inflict enough death and suffering that Palestinians will blame Hamas and turn against them. And that's always been the goal in Lebanon, in Palestine, across the region, in Iraq, with the sanctions and bombing prior to the US invasion, inflict direct suffering on the civilian population, the hope that they will turn against the rulers. Of course, that was also the policy in Syria, which we just spoke about with Helena Cobban. So that's the context to see this in, their interest. And Mohammed Shahade, who is a journalist, he's worked with the Euromed for Human Rights, he's now a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, did a tweet thread on this that was a really good, quick analysis. And I'm going to take us through that and comment on some of the things he says. So the first thing is it does appear that there were protests in Beit Lahia in the north, or rallies, and there are lots of photos of these. And what's notable, and you can see this, Arabic readers will see this in the photo there that Mohammed Shahade posted, that people are holding protest signs, and the ones there, and I've seen other similar ones in photos, they say, "We refuse to die, our children's blood is not cheap, stop the war." None of these signs, not one that I've seen, says anything related to Hamas. There is no evidence that this protest was organized in advance to target Hamas. And these signs are similar to other protests we've seen in Gaza, particularly involving children, that were organized to scream out, "We're human, stop murdering us." And they are directed at those who are uh, doing the genocide. They're not directed at Hamas. So if we go to the next tweet in Mohammed Shahada's thread, you can see there he says, "The protests seem to have started spontaneously in small numbers in limited areas. Their grievances are genuine. People are tired, desperate for the genocide to end at any cost. Many want Hamas to step down from government to take away Israel's pretext for the siege and killing." And again, that sign of the girl in the photo doesn't say anything about Hamas. It just says, "Atfal Palestine bidna naish," children of Palestine, we children of Palestine want to live. But what he's saying there is not like anything that people would need to go out and protest about, because Hamas has said very clearly it has no interest in governing Gaza. They're the ones who wanted the ceasefire, who have stuck to it, to the letter. As John pointed out, they're still talking about going back to the ceasefire. So why would people need to protest against Hamas when Hamas, A, has no interest in ruling Gaza? They've said so. They're willing to hand over to a sort of non-partisan technocratic committee that's proposed in the Egyptian plan we talked about a couple of years ago that Hamas publicly welcomed. And they're the ones committed to ending the war. So let's go to the next slide, or the next tweet in Mohammed Shahada's thread, where he says, "The protests quickly drew the interest and influence of external actors keen to exploit Gaza's despair and pain, and this may end up undermining the movement instead of helping. For example, Israel demanding Gazans take to the streets or face death, land theft, and forever war will backfire." I mean, I wouldn't go far as calling it a movement. I mean, Mohammed Shahada uses that word, but this seems to have been a spontaneous rally or an organized rally in Beit Lahia against the war and against the genocide, not against Hamas. But I'll come to the part about the anti-Hamas element that is appears to be separate from this protest, where you see the children, the signs, in a second. But let's look at the next tweet, Tamara, where Muhammad notes, "When Israel suddenly blesses Palestinians' right to expression against Hamas while detaining, maiming, and murdering those exercising the same right against the occupation, it discourages people from taking part in the protest lest they be called Israel's collaborators." Well, again, the protests are not about Hamas. From what I've seen, the photos of the protests, which were organized, had nothing to do with Hamas. And of course, Israel doesn't just murder those protesting against, they're starving and murdering everyone. And so the idea that Israel or its government would care about anyone in Gaza is ludicrous on its face, or the US or Western politicians who've been helping this. So again, you see in that screenshot, there have been videos circulating where you can hear some slogans about Hamas. And let's take a look at the next slide. And before we play the video, Tamara, I just want to read what Mohammed Shahada says, and then we'll play the video. But what he says, again, to give some context, there are some videos circulating, and they've been reported in the New York Times and others, where you can see some people shouting specifically anti-Hamas slogans. I do not see them as being in the same context of those children we saw earlier on holding the signs against the genocide. These seem to be just groups of men going around. And Mohammed Shahada says, an apparent Fatah influence is detectable in some of today's protests, with the chant Ya Shia being added. And I'm going to explain what he means by that. Of course, Fatah is the political faction aligned with Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority leader in Ramallah. And Fatah is the only faction Israel doesn't list as a terrorist organization, because Fatah is the ruling party in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that is closely allied with Israel, the Palestinian Authority. And the chant, Ya Shia, Shiites, as Muhammad Shahada points out, is being used, it's a sectarian chant being used to accuse Hamas of being sort of an extension or proxies of Iran, which is a view held not by many Palestinians, but certainly by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Fatah and Israel. You won't find many Palestinians on the ground in Gaza who think that, but certainly the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah do. And notably, this chant of Ya Shia, Ya Shia, which is a very insulting, sectarian, anti-Shia chant, did appear in 2007. And this was in the brief civil war, you could call it, between Fatah and Hamas that followed Hamas's election victory in the 2006 Palestinian Authority elections. And then what happened in those elections is that the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority aligned with the United States and the United Arab Emirates, basically to carry out a coup against Hamas that had been elected. And in that context, that chant of Shia, Shia was heard time and again. And it's important for people to know that Palestinians are Palestinian Muslims, who are the majority of Palestinians, are all Sunni. Of course, there might be a tiny handful of exceptions, but there is no Shia, Sunni Shia distinction among Palestinians. So the use of Shia in this context is a purely political denigration of Shia and using it against Hamas in order to paint them as proxies of Iran. And we can actually see, sorry, go ahead, Asa, but we're going to look at a video of that.
Okay.
Shall we look at the video and then?
Yeah, let's look at the video, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let's show that video, Tamara. So you can see those young men shouting Ya Shia, Ya Shia, which is a very uncharacteristic, and again takes us directly back to that coup plot in 2007.
Just to quickly say, I was living in the West Bank in 2006, 2007 when that was happening and in the build up to that. And I remember there was a speech of Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah where it was, it was very widely reported that chant was being used by the Fatah hooligans, you could say. It was the era of the sort of sectarian agitation against Lebanon, especially, but by the US and Saudi proxies.
Yeah, it's even worse. I covered those demonstrations on the ground in Gaza for a number of times, and they were even worse than that. They chanted Shia, but they also chanted the era of the bottle will return, which was like the way that the PA used to rape and torture Hamas prisoners. In those demonstrations were vile demonstrations, and that chant has 10 layers of brutal vulgarity to it. It's really disappointing, deeply disappointing to hear.
Deeply disappointing, but entirely uncharacteristic of Palestinians in general, and Palestinians in Gaza in particular. The idea that this is some kind of organic protest movement against Hamas is completely demolished by the reappearance of this chant, which is so particularly connected with a character I'll talk about in a second, Muhammad Dahlan. I'll come back to that. But let's take a look at Muhammad Shahada's next tweet, Tamara, in which he points out that Israeli media identified one of the protesters as someone whose family is affiliated with Muhammad Dahlan's Fatah. Similarly, a Fatah influence on the demonstrations will make it easier for Hamas to dismiss, delegitimize them as pushed by an external agenda. And there we can see this article from Mako, which is the news website of Israel's Channel 10. And what this article points out is that in one of these videos of the supposed anti-Hamas protests in Gaza, they have identified someone called Hisham Birawi. I don't know him, but they say that Birawi is, and this I'm reading from this Mako article, is a member of the extended family of Hisham Abdul Raziq and Sufyan Abu Zaida, people lawyer to senior leader of the Palestinian Hamas movement, Mohammed Dahlan, who do not take any step without him. They are directly or indirectly identified with the Fatah movement. His identification also indicates that Fatah members have begun to raise their heads in Gaza, and it is possible that this symbolizes the weakening of Hamas's reign of terror, even though previous cases ended in the murder of some demonstrators. So you can hear the Israeli spin there. But what they seem to be saying, or what they believe, I haven't independently verified what they're saying, is that these protests are associated with Mohammed Dahlan. Who is Mohammed Dahlan? Well, if we move to look at this article from Vanity Fair in 2008 called The Gaza Bombshell, and I really recommend this article. You can find it online for free. And this explains the whole planning of that Gaza coup, where Mohammed Dahlan, this Fatah leader who is from Gaza, who was aligned with, who was part of the Palestinian Authority, who was the intelligence chief in Gaza, a very brutal, thuggish man, closely aligned with Israel, because the Palestinian Authority was set up to work closely with Israel. And after Hamas won those elections in 2006, the Bush administration at the time, Condoleezza Rice, according to this reporting, Bush personally approved this. He said, Mohammed Dahlan, he's our guy. That's in this article that you can read. And this coup plot was funded by the United Arab Emirates. These militias associated with Dahlan were trained in order to try to take on Hamas and overthrow them. And what happened instead in June 2007 is that Hamas basically defeated them, kicked them out of Gaza, kicked Mohammed Dahlan out of Gaza. They fled to the West Bank via Israel. Israel helped transport them from Gaza to the West Bank. So they were really Israeli proxies. But all the reporting is that Mohammed Dahlan still has some loyalists, perhaps including, family or whatever it is in Gaza. There's certainly an influence of money. Mohammed Dahlan is sponsored by the United Arab Emirates and based in the United Arab Emirates, and can probably motivate some people in Gaza, particularly given the levels of desperation there, and create these scenes which are probably very small and have been, I think, wrongly associated with this protest we saw that was aimed at the world and against the genocide and not against Hamas, to try to co-opt them for this agenda. And what I want to say is that these efforts to sort of astroturf, and this is not to say, people shouldn't mistake what I'm saying. This is not to say that there aren't people in Gaza who oppose Hamas, or that people in Gaza don't have the right to oppose Hamas. Of course they do. When there was an election in Gaza, not everyone voted for Hamas, even though they won. That's not to say anything of the sort. But the idea that in the middle of a genocide, people are going to go out and start protesting against Hamas, as if people in Gaza don't understand who is actually murdering them and besieging them, and who wanted the ceasefire and stuck to the ceasefire, and who violated it, doesn't pass the sniff test. And so these efforts to instrumentalize and cheer on Dahlan basically as an instrument of Israeli and American policy go back many years and continued even after Dahlan was expelled from Gaza. So if we look, for example, at this item from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which I'll remind people is a pro-Israel think tank that,
putting it mildly.
it's actually an offshoot of AIPAC, the massive Israel lobby group that we've all heard of. And this is from 2013, an article by an Israeli called 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿, and he says the call for rebellion against Hamas in Gaza, and it's sort of looking for signs like, can we find, this effort to instigate the rebellion. And he says 3 main players in Fatah are involved in quiet efforts to encourage Gazans to take to the streets against Hamas. Again, this was in 2013. And he names 2 of them. One is Majid Faraj, who is currently the head of the West Bank Palestinian Authority's intelligence service. Another is Azzam al-Ahmad, who is, again, a senior associate of Mahmoud Abbas. And he says the third effort is managed by Mohammed Dahlan, the ex-strongman in the Gaza Strip who fell out with Abbas and who now operates through Dubai with the full support of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. So that's from 2013, just to show you how far back the roots of this protest go. And finally, just again, we talked last week about Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz and his genocidal statements, threats and to the people of Gaza, and he issued another such threatening video recently. And with this video that he posted on Twitter is also a text where he says, and I think he says the same thing in the video, the first Sinwar destroyed Gaza, and the second Sinwar is ready to burn half of Gaza with his own hands just to try and maintain his corrupt rule alongside his fellow Hamas murderers and rapists. I mean, this is language he's addressing to people in Gaza, and he says, they sit safely with their families in tunnels or luxury hotels with billions in foreign bank accounts. I wasn't aware there were any functioning luxury hotels in Gaza, but there you go. And he says, while using you as hostages. But then he says, learn from the residents of Beit Lahia, just as they did, demand the removal of Hamas from Gaza and the immediate release of all Israeli hostages. This is the only way to stop the war. So this effort to instrumentalize these astroturfed anti-Hamas protests, I'm calling them astroturfed. That's my analysis based on my knowledge and understanding of the situation. People in Gaza may protest. They may have gone out. There may have been a spontaneous protest, but to the extent that we heard those specifically anti-Hamas chants, I don't believe that's organic. Not for a second. That's my assessment and my analysis. Others may have a different view, but that's what I conclude from what I've seen so far. And it's not a coincidence that this happened now, that this all appeared in the Israeli and Western media at the same time. And Israeli media referred to tribal muhtars, tribal leaders in northern Gaza who were behind these anti-Hamas protests, which again, you'll recall in the early months of the genocide, Israel tried to organize an alternative collaborator government in Gaza with so-called tribal leaders and got absolutely nowhere. And I think this is a similar flavor to that type of effort.
Thank you for fleshing that out. I mean, yesterday, people who don't, normally look for alternatives to mainstream corporate media to get their news about Palestine were very, I got questions just kind of out in the world yesterday about the protests. And I said, well, there were some protests. I explained to them about the astroturfing nature of them. And I said,
we should say what astroturfing is,
Yes.
because we have a lot of listeners from around the world. And I had to learn this because it relates to American football and sports, which I have very little knowledge about. Maybe Canadian football and sports too, I don't know. But AstroTurf is basically fake grass. It's like a type of
Yeah.
plastic grass that they put on fields and on the football field and play on. And the term astroturf is in contrast to grassroots.
Right.
Grassroots meaning sort of an
Organic.
authentic,
Yes.
organic
Community-based.
movement or uprising. So astroturf means a movement that is generated to look like it is grassroots. And so we've seen sort of the term color revolutions.
Right.
Well, color revolutions might be a form of astroturfing. So that's
Right.
what we're referring to.
Right. Right. And people were, hearing about that from CNN and MSNBC and all the in New York Times, but they were not seeing the videos that we all saw yesterday of, shredded children in hospital morgues and a man cradling the decapitated head of his toddler. Those, there is always there is always an undercurrent of what is not shown. The mainstream media loves to say that Palestinians, are being ruled with an iron fist by this, despotic Hamas regime that doesn't have, Palestinian interests at heart, and they should just surrender and give their power away to the friendly actors of the Palestinian Authority. And meanwhile, like, who is the one doing the violence? Who is the party that is enacting all of this misery on Palestinians? It's never named. It's never clarified. And so it was just a very interesting operation yesterday, and I'm assuming that we're going to start seeing more of that.
Because at no point has the Palestinian Authority and those associated with it, even though Mohammed Dahlan has fallen out with Mahmoud Abbas, they didn't fall out over any matter of principle. As the saying goes, there's no honor among thieves. They argue over power, over money, over control, not over. So, but the basic alliance, or who their alliances are with, is the same. They're allied with Israel. They're allied with American proxies in the region. And at no point throughout this genocide has the Palestinian Authority or those types of figures like Dahlan ever abandoned that alliance. On the contrary, as we've reported, the Palestinian Authority remains fully committed to its alliance with Israel, fully committed to acting on behalf of Israel and the United States to crush Palestinian resistance, and eager to ride back into Gaza on the back of Israeli tanks. And so it's the least surprising thing in the world that these same elements will be trying to astroturf so-called anti-Hamas protests. We're not in an era of normal politics here where, again, as I said, there's a lot of diversity in the political views of Palestinians. Not all of them support Hamas. Not all Palestinians support Fatah or the PFLP or whichever group you might want to name. But there is a consensus around the right to resist, and that people will support resistance wherever it comes from, regardless of their political views. So none of it passes the smell test.
Yeah, absolutely.